Master word list. Words starting with letter D. Dabble means splash around. For example, the amateur painter dabbled at art, but seldom produced a finished piece. Dais means raised platform for guests of honor. For example, when he approached the dais, he was greeted by cheers from the people who had come to honor him. Dank means damp. For example, the walls of the dungeon were dank and slimy. Dapper means neat and trim. For example, in The Odd Couple TV show, Tony Randall played Felix Unger, an excessively dapper soul who could not stand to have a hair out of place. Dappled means spotted. For example, the sunlight filtering through the screens created a dappled effect on the wall. Daub means smear. For example, from the way he daubed his paint on the canvas, I could tell he knew nothing of oils. Daunt means intimidate, frighten. For example, boast all you like of your prowess. Mere words cannot daunt me, the hero answered the villain. Dauntless means bold. For example, despite the dangerous nature of the undertaking, the dauntless soldier volunteered for the assignment. Dawdle means loiter, waste time. For example, we have to meet a deadline, so don't dawdle, just get down to work. Deadlock means standstill, stalemate. For example, because negotiations had reached a deadlock, some of the delegates had begun to mutter about breaking off the talks. Deadpan means wooden, impersonal. For example, we wanted to see how long he could maintain his deadpan expression. Dearth means scarcity. For example, the dearth of skilled labor compelled the employers to open trade schools. Debacle means sudden downfall, complete disaster. For example, in the airplane movies, every flight turns into a debacle, with passengers and crew members collapsing, engines falling apart, and carry-on baggage popping out of the overhead bins. Debase means lower in esteem, degrade. For example, in The King and L, Anna refuses to kneel down and prostrate herself before the king, for she feels that to do so would debase her position, and she will not submit to such debasement. Debauch means corrupt. For example, did Socrates' teachings lead the young men of Athens to be virtuous citizens, or did they debauch the young men, causing them to question the customs of their fathers? Debilitate means weaken, enfeeble. For example, Michael's severe bout of the flu debilitated him so much that he was too tired to go to work for a week. Debonair means friendly, aiming to please. For example, the debonair youth was liked by all who met him, because of his cheerful and obliging manner. Debris means rubble. For example, a full year after the earthquake in Mexico City, they were still carting away the debris. Debunk means expose as false, exaggerated, worthless. For example, pointing out that he consistently had voted against strengthening anti-pollution legislation, reporters debunked the candidate's claim that he was a fervent environmentalist. Debutante means young woman making formal entrance into society. For example, as a debutante, she was often mentioned in the society columns of the newspapers. Decadence means decay. For example, the moral decadence of the people was reflected in the lewd literature of the period. Decapitate means behead. For example, they did not hang Lady Jane Grey, they decapitated her. Decelerate means slow down. For example, seeing the emergency blinkers in the road ahead, he decelerated quickly. Deciduous means falling off as of leaves. For example, the oak is a deciduous tree. In winter it looks quite bare. Decimate means kill. For example, we do more to decimate our population in automobile accidents than we do in war. Decipher means interpret secret code. For example, lacking his code book, the spy was unable to decipher the scrambled message sent to him from the KGB. Declivity means downward slope. For example, the children love to ski down the declivity. Décolleté means having a low-necked dress. For example, current fashion decrees that evening gowns be décolleté this season. Bare shoulders are again the vogue. Decomposition means decay. For example, despite the body's advanced state of decomposition, the police were able to identify the murdered man. Decorum means propriety, orderliness and good taste in manners. For example, even the best-mannered students have trouble behaving with decorum on the last day of school. Decoy means lure or bait. For example, the wild ducks were not fooled by the decoy. Decrepit means worn out by age. For example, the decrepit car blocked traffic on the highway. Decrepitude means state of collapse caused by illness or old age. For example, I was unprepared for the state of decrepitude in which I had found my old friend. He seemed to have aged 20 years in 6 months. Decry means express strong disapproval of. For example, the founder of the Children's Defense Fund, Marian Wright Edelman, strongly decries the lack of financial and moral support for children in America today. Deducible means derived by reasoning. For example, if we accept your premise, your conclusions are easily deducible. Deface means disfigure. For example, if you deface a library book, you will have to pay a hefty fine. Defame means malign, slander. For example, if you try to defame my good name, my lawyers will see you in court. Default means failure to act. For example, when the visiting team failed to show up for the big game, they lost the game by default. Defeatist means attitude of one who is ready to accept defeat as a natural outcome. For example, if you maintain your defeatist attitude, you will never succeed. Defection means desertion. For example, the children who had made him an idol were hurt most by his defection from our cause. Defer means delay till later, exempt temporarily. For example, in wartime, some young men immediately volunteer to serve, others defer, making plans until they hear from their draft boards. Defer means give in respectfully, submit. For example, when it comes to making decisions about purchasing software, we must defer to Michael, our computer guru. He gets the final word. Deference means courteous regard for another's wish. For example, in deference to the minister's request, please do not take photographs during the wedding service. Defiance means refusal to yield, resistance. For example, when John reached the terrible twos, he responded to every parental request with howls of defiance. Defile means pollute. For example, the hoodlums defiled the church with their scurrilous writing. Definitive means final, complete. For example, Carl Sandburg's Abraham Lincoln may be regarded as the definitive work on the life of the great emancipator. Deflect means turn aside. For example, his life was saved when his cigarette case deflected the bullet. Defoliate means destroy leaves. For example, in Vietnam the army made extensive use of chemical agents to defoliate the woodlands. Defray means pay the costs of. For example, her employer offered to defray the costs of her postgraduate education. Deft means neat, skillful. For example, the deft waiter uncorked the champagne without spilling a drop. Defunct means no longer in use or existence. For example, the lawyers sought to examine the books of the defunct corporation. Diffuse means remove the fuse of a bomb, reduce or eliminate a threat. For example, police negotiators are trained to diffuse dangerous situations by avoiding confrontational language and behavior. Degenerate means become worse, deteriorate. For example, as the fight dragged on, the champion's style degenerated until he could barely keep on his feet. Degradation means humiliation, debasement, degeneration. For example, some secretaries object to fetching the boss a cup of coffee because they resent the degradation of being made to do such lowly tasks. Dehydrate means remove water from, dry out. For example, running under a hot sun quickly dehydrates the body. Joggers soon learn to carry water bottles and to drink from them frequently. Deify means turn into a god, idolize. For example, admire Elvis Presley all you want, just don't deify him. Deign means condescend. For example, the celebrated fashion designer would not deign to speak to a mere seamstress. His overburdened assistant had to convey the master's wishes to the lowly workers. Delectable means delightful, delicious. For example, we thanked our host for a most delectable meal. Delete means erase, strike out. For example, less is more. If you delete this paragraph, your whole essay will have greater appeal. Deleterious means harmful. For example, if you believe that smoking is deleterious to your health, and the Surgeon General certainly does, then quit. Deliberate means consider, ponder. For example, offered the new job, she asked for time to deliberate before she told them her decision. Delineate means portray, depict, sketch. For example, using only a few descriptive phrases, Austen delineates the character of Mr. Collins so well that we can predict his every move. Delirium means mental disorder marked by confusion. For example, in his delirium, the drunkard saw pink panthers and talking pigs. Delude means deceive. For example, his mistress may have deluded herself into believing that he would leave his wife and marry her. Deluge means flood, rush. For example, when we advertised the position, we received a deluge of applications. Delusion means false belief. For example, Don suffers from delusions of grandeur. He thinks he's a world-famous author when he's published just one paperback book. Delve means dig, investigate. For example, delving into old books and manuscripts is part of a researcher's job. Demagogue means false leader of people. For example, he was accused of being a demagogue because he made promises that aroused futile hopes in his listeners. Demean means degrade, humiliate. For example, standing on his dignity, he refused to demean himself by replying to the offensive letter. Demeanor means behavior, bearing. For example, his sober demeanor quieted the noisy revelers. Demented means insane. For example, Dr. Demento was a lunatic radio personality who liked to act as if he were truly demented. Demise means death. For example, upon the demise of the dictator, a bitter dispute about succession to power developed. Demolition means destruction. For example, one of the major aims of the Air Force was the complete demolition of all means of transportation by bombing of rail lines and terminals. Demoniac means fiendish. For example, the Spanish Inquisition devised many demoniac means of torture. Demur means hesitate. For example, when offered a post on the board of directors, David demurred. He had scruples about taking on the job because he was unsure he could handle it in addition to his other responsibilities. Demure means grave, serious. For example, she was demure and reserved, a nice modest girl whom any young man would be proud to take home to his mother. Demystify means clarify, free from mystery. For example, helpful doctors demystify medical procedures by describing them in everyday language, explaining that a myringotomy, for example, is an operation involving making a small hole in one's eardrum. Denigrate means blacken. For example, all attempts to denigrate the character of our late president have failed. The people still love him and cherish his memory. Denizen means inhabitant or resident, regular visitor. For example, in The Untouchables, Elliot Ness fights Al Capone and the other denizens of Chicago's underworld. Denotation means meaning, distinguishing by name. For example, a dictionary will always give us the denotation of a word. Frequently, it will also give us the connotations. Denouement means final development of the plot of a play. For example, the play was childishly written. The denouement was obvious to sophisticated theatergoers as early as the middle of the first act. Denounce means condemn, criticize. For example, the reform candidate denounced the corrupt city officers for having betrayed the public's trust. Depict means portray. For example, in this sensational exposé, the author depicts Beatle John Lennon as a drug-crazed neurotic. Deplete means reduce, exhaust. For example, we must wait until we deplete our present inventory before we order replacements. Deplore means regret, disapprove of. For example, although I deplore the vulgarity of your language, I defend your right to express yourself freely. Deploy means spread out in an extended battle line. For example, the general ordered the battalion to deploy in order to meet the enemy offensive. Depose means dethrone, remove from office. For example, the army attempted to depose the king and set up a military government. Deposition means testimony under oath. For example, he made his deposition in the judge's chamber. Depravity means extreme corruption, wickedness. For example, the depravity of Caligula's behavior came to sicken even those who had willingly participated in his earlier, comparatively innocent orgies. Deprecate means express disapproval of, protest against. For example, a firm believer in old-fashioned courtesy, Miss Post deprecated the modern tendency to address new acquaintances by their first names. Depreciate means lessen in value. For example, if you neglect this property, it will depreciate. Depredation means plundering. For example, after the depredations of the invaders, the people were penniless. Deranged means insane. For example, he had to be institutionalized because he was mentally deranged. Derelict means abandoned, negligent. For example, the derelict craft was a menace to navigation. Deride means ridicule, make fun of. For example, the critics derided his pretentious dialogue and refused to consider his plays seriously. Derivative means unoriginal, derived from another source. For example, although her early poetry was clearly derivative in nature, the critics thought she had promise and eventually would find her own voice. Dermatologist means one who studies the skin and its diseases. For example, I advise you to consult a dermatologist about your acne. Derogatory means expressing a low opinion. For example, I resent your derogatory remarks. Descant means discuss fully. For example, he was willing to descant upon any topic of conversation, even when he knew very little about the subject under discussion. Descry means catch sight of. For example, in the distance, we could barely descry the enemy vessels. Desecrate means violate the sanctity of. For example, shattering the altar and trampling the holy objects underfoot, the invaders desecrated the sanctuary. Desiccate means dry up. For example, a tour of this smokehouse will give you an idea of how the pioneers used to desiccate food in order to preserve it. Desolate means unpopulated. For example, after 6 months in the crowded, bustling metropolis, David was so sick of people that he was ready to head for the most desolate patch of wilderness he could find. Desolate means rob of joy. For example, the bandits desolated the countryside, burning farms and carrying off the harvest. Despise means regard as worthless or distasteful. For example, Mr. Bond, I despise spies. I look down on them as mean, despicable, honorless men, whom I would wipe from the face of the earth with as little concern as I would scrape dog droppings from the bottom of my shoe. Despoil means plunder. For example, if you do not yield, I am afraid the enemy will despoil the countryside. Despondent means depressed, gloomy. For example, to the dismay of his parents, William became seriously despondent after he broke up with Jan. They despaired of finding a cure for his gloom. Despot means tyrant, harsh, authoritarian ruler. For example, how could a benevolent king turn overnight into a despot? Destitute means extremely poor. For example, because they had no health insurance, the father's costly illness left the family destitute. Desultory means aimless, haphazard. For example, in prison Malcolm X set himself the task of reading straight through the dictionary. To him, reading was purposeful, not desultory. Detached means emotionally removed, calm and objective. For example, a psychoanalyst must maintain a detached point of view and stay uninvolved with his or her patients' personal lives. Detergent means cleansing agent. For example, many new detergents have replaced soap. Determination means resolve, measurement, or calculation. For example, nothing could shake his determination that his children would get the best education that money could buy. Deterrent means something that discourages, hindrance. For example, does the threat of capital punishment serve as a deterrent to potential killers? Detonation means explosion. For example, the detonation of the bomb could be heard miles away. Detraction means slandering, aspersion. For example, he is offended by your frequent detractions of his ability as a leader. Detrimental means harmful, damaging. For example, the candidate's acceptance of major financial contributions from a well-known racist ultimately proved detrimental to his campaign, for he lost the backing of many of his early grassroots supporters. Deviate means turn away from, depart, diverge. For example, Richard never deviated from his daily routine. Every day he set off for work at 8 o'clock, had his sack lunch, peanut butter on whole wheat, at 12:15, and headed home at the stroke of 5. Devious means roundabout, erratic, not straightforward. For example, the Joker's plan was so devious that it was only with great difficulty we could follow its shifts and dodges. Devise means think up, invent, plan. For example, how clever he must be to have devised such a devious plan. What ingenious inventions might he have devised if he had turned his mind to science and not to crime? Devoid means lacking. For example, you may think her mind is a total void, but she's actually not devoid of intelligence. She just sounds like an airhead. Devotee means enthusiastic follower. For example, a devotee of the opera, he bought season tickets every year. Devout means pious. For example, the devout man prayed daily. Dexterous means skillful. For example, the magician was so dexterous that we could not follow him as he performed his tricks. Diabolical means devilish. For example, what a fiend I am, to devise such a diabolical scheme to destroy Gotham City, chortled the Joker gleefully. Diagnosis means analysis of a condition. For example, in medical school Margaret developed her skill at diagnosis, learning how to read volumes from a rapid pulse or a hacking cough. Discomfit means put to rout, defeat. For example, this ruse will discomfit the enemy. Discomposure means agitation, loss of poise. For example, perpetually poised, Agent 007 never exhibited a moment's discomposure. Disconcert means confuse, upset, embarrass. For example, the lawyer was disconcerted by the evidence produced by her adversary. Disconsolate means sad. For example, the death of his wife left him disconsolate. Discord means conflict, lack of harmony. For example, watching Tweedledum battle Tweedledee, Alice wondered what had caused this pointless discord. Discordant means not harmonious, conflicting. For example, nothing is quite so discordant as the sound of a junior high school orchestra tuning up. Discount means disregard, dismiss. For example, be prepared to discount what he has to say about his ex-wife. Discourse means formal discussion, conversation. For example, the young Plato was drawn to the agora to hear the philosophical discourse of Socrates and his followers. Discredit means destroy confidence in, disbelieve. For example, the campaign was highly negative in tone. Each candidate tried to discredit the other. Discrepancy means lack of consistency, difference. For example, The police noticed some discrepancies in his description of the crime and did not believe him. Discrete means separate, unconnected. For example, the universe is composed of discrete bodies. Discretion means ability to adjust actions to circumstances. For example, use your discretion in this matter and do not discuss it with anyone. Discriminating means able to see differences, prejudiced. For example, a superb interpreter of Picasso, she was sufficiently discriminating to judge the most complex works of modern art. Discursive means digressing, rambling. For example, as the lecturer wandered from topic to topic, we wondered what if any point there was to his discursive remarks. Disdain means view with scorn or contempt. For example, in the film Funny Face, the bookish heroine disdained fashion models for their lack of intellectual interests. Disembark means go ashore, unload cargo from a ship. For example, before the passengers could disembark, they had to pick up their passports from the ship's purser. Disenfranchise means deprive of a civil right. For example, the imposition of the poll tax effectively disenfranchised poor Southern blacks, who lost their right to vote. Disengage means uncouple, separate, disconnect. For example, a standard movie routine involves the hero's desperate attempt to disengage a railroad car from a moving train. Disfigure means mar in beauty, spoil. For example, an ugly frown disfigured his normally pleasant face. Disgorge means surrender something, eject. For example, unwilling to disgorge the cash he had stolen from the pension fund, the embezzler tried to run away. Disgruntle means make discontented. For example, the passengers were disgruntled by the numerous delays. Dishearten means discourage, cause to lose courage. For example, his failure to pass the bar exam disheartened him. Disheveled means untidy. For example, your disheveled appearance will hurt your chances in this interview. Disinclination means unwillingness. For example, some mornings I feel a great disinclination to get out of bed. Disingenuous means insincere. For example, now that we know the mayor and his wife are engaged in a bitter divorce fight, we find their earlier remarks regretting their lack of time together remarkably disingenuous. Disinter means dig up, unearth. For example, they disinterred the body and held an autopsy. Disinterested means unprejudiced. For example, given the judge's political ambitions and the lawyer's financial interest in the case, the only disinterested person in the courtroom may have been the court reporter. Disjointed means disconnected. For example, his remarks were so disjointed that we could not follow his reasoning. Dislodge means remove forcibly. For example, thrusting her fist up under the choking man's lower ribs, Margaret used the Heimlich maneuver to dislodge the food caught in his throat. Dismantle means take apart. For example, when the show closed, they dismantled the scenery before storing it. Dismay means discourage, frighten. For example, the huge amount of work she had left to do dismayed her. Dismember means cut into small parts. For example, when the Austrian Empire was dismembered, several new countries were established. Dismiss means put away from consideration, reject. For example, believing in John's love for her, she dismissed the notion that he might be unfaithful. Disparage means belittle. For example, a doting mother, Emma, was more likely to praise her son's crude attempts at art than to disparage them. Disparate means basically different, unrelated. For example, unfortunately, Tony and Tina have disparate notions of marriage. Tony sees it as a carefree extended love affair, while Tina sees it as a solemn commitment to build a family and a home. Disparity means difference, condition of inequality. For example, their disparity in rank made no difference at all to the prince and Cinderella. Dispassionate means calm, impartial. For example, known in the company for his cool judgment, Bill could impartially examine the causes of a problem, giving a dispassionate analysis of what had gone wrong, and go on to suggest how to correct the mess. Dispatch means speediness, prompt execution. For example, young Napoleon defeated the enemy with all possible dispatch. He then sent a dispatch to headquarters informing his commander of the great victory. Dispel means scatter, drive away. For example, the bright sunlight eventually dispelled the morning mist. Disperse means scatter. For example, the police fired tear gas into the crowd to disperse the protesters. Dispirited means lacking in spirit. For example, the coach used all the tricks at his command to buoy up the enthusiasm of his team, which had become dispirited at the loss of the star player. Disputatious means argumentative, fond of arguing. For example, convinced he knew more than his lawyers, Alan was a disputatious client, ready to argue about the best way to conduct the case. Disquiet means make uneasy or anxious. For example, Holmes's absence for a day slightly disquieted Watson. After a week with no word, however, Watson's uneasiness about his missing friend had grown into a deep fear for his safety. Dissection means cutting apart in order to examine. For example, the dissection of frogs in the laboratory is particularly unpleasant to some students. Dissemble means disguise, pretend. For example, even though John tried to dissemble his motive for taking modern dance, we all knew he was there not to dance, but to meet girls. Disseminate means distribute, spread, scatter. For example, by their use of the Internet, propagandists have been able to disseminate their pet doctrines to new audiences around the globe. Dissent means disagree. For example, in the recent Supreme Court decision, Justice O'Connor dissented from the majority opinion. Dissertation means formal essay. For example, in order to earn a graduate degree from many of our universities, a candidate is frequently required to prepare a dissertation on some scholarly subject. Dissident means dissenting, rebellious. For example, in the purge that followed the student demonstrations at Tiananmen Square, the government hunted down the dissident students and their supporters. Dissimulate means pretend, conceal by feigning. For example, she tried to dissimulate her grief by her exuberant attitude. Dissipate means squander, waste, scatter. For example, he is a fine artist, but I fear he may dissipate his gifts if he keeps wasting his time playing games. Dissolute means loosen morals. For example, the dissolute life led by the ancient Romans is indeed shocking. Dissolution means breaking of a union, termination. For example, which caused King Lear more suffering, the dissolution of his kingdom into warring factions, or the dissolution of his aged, failing body. Dissonance means discord. For example, composer Charles Ives often used dissonance clashing or unresolved chords for special effects in his musical works. Dissuade means persuade not to do, discourage. For example, since Tom could not dissuade Huck from running away from home, he decided to run away with him. Distant means reserved or aloof, cold in manner. For example, his distant greeting made me feel unwelcome from the start. Distend means expand, swell out. For example, I can tell when he is under stress by the way the veins distend on his forehead. Distill means extract the essence, purify, refine. For example, a moonshiner distills mash into whiskey, an epigrammatist distills thoughts into quips. Distinction means honor, contrast, discrimination. For example, a holder of the Medal of Honor, George served with great distinction in World War II. Distort means twist out of shape. For example, it is difficult to believe the newspaper accounts of the riots because of the way some reporters distort and exaggerate the actual events. Distraught means upset, distracted by anxiety. For example, the distraught parents frantically searched the ravine for their lost child. Diurnal means daily. For example, a farmer cannot neglect his diurnal tasks at any time. Cows, for example, must be milked regularly. Diva means operatic singer, prima donna. For example, although world famous as a diva, she did not indulge in fits of temperament. Diverge means vary, go in different directions. For example, the spokes of the wheel diverge from the hub. Divergent means differing, deviating. For example, since graduating from medical school, the two doctors have taken divergent paths, one going on to become a nationally prominent surgeon, the other dedicating himself to a small family practice in his hometown. Diverse means various. For example, the professor suggested diverse ways of approaching the assignment and recommended that we choose one of them. Diversion means act of turning aside. For example, after studying for several hours, he needed a diversion from work. Diversity means variety, dissimilitude. For example, the diversity of colleges in this country indicates that many levels of ability are being cared for. Divest means strip, deprive. For example, he was divested of his power to act and could no longer govern. Divine means perceive intuitively, foresee the future. For example, nothing infuriated Tom more than Aunt Polly's ability to divine when he was telling the truth. Divulge means reveal. For example, no lover of gossip, Charlotte would never divulge anything that a friend told her in confidence. Docile means obedient, easily managed. For example, as docile as he seems today, that old lion was once a ferocious, snarling beast. Doctrinaire means dogmatic, unyielding. For example, Wang had hoped that the student-led democracy movement might bring about change in China, but the repressive response of the doctrinaire hardliners crushed his dreams of democracy. Doctrine means teachings, in general, particular principle. For example, he was so committed to the doctrines of his faith that he was unable to evaluate them impartially. Document means provide written evidence. For example, she kept all the receipts from her business trip in order to document her expenses for the firm. Doff means take off. For example, a gentleman used to doff his hat to a lady. Dogged means determined, stubborn. For example, Les Miserables tells of Inspector Javert's long, dogged pursuit of the criminal Jean Valjean. Doggerel means poor verse. For example, although we find occasional snatches of genuine poetry in her work, most of her writing is mere doggerel. Dogmatic means opinionated, arbitrary, doctrinal. For example, we tried to discourage Doug from being so dogmatic, but never could convince him that his opinions might be wrong. Doldrums means listlessness, slack period. For example, once the excitement of meeting her deadline was over, she found herself in the doldrums. Doleful means sorrowful. For example, he found the doleful lamentations of the bereaved family emotionally disturbing and he left as quickly as he could. Dolt means stupid person. For example, I thought I was talking to a mature audience. Instead, I find myself addressing a pack of dolts and idiots. Domicile means home. For example, although his legal domicile was in New York City, his work kept him away from his residence for many years. Domineer means rule over tyrannically. For example, students prefer teachers who guide, not ones who domineer. Don means put on. For example, when Clark Kent has to don his Superman outfit, he changes clothes in a convenient phone booth. Doodle means scribble or draw aimlessly, waste time. For example, arts teachers scolded him when he doodled all over the margins of his papers. Dormant means sleeping, lethargic, latent. For example, at 50 her long dormant ambition to write flared up once more. Within a year, she had completed the first of her great historical novels. Dormer means window projecting from roof. For example, in remodeling the attic into a bedroom, we decided that we needed to put in dormers to provide sufficient ventilation for the new room. Dossier means file of documents on a subject. For example, ordered by J. Edgar Hoover to investigate the senator, the FBI compiled a complete dossier on him. Dote means be excessively fond of. For example, not only grandmothers bore you with stories about their brilliant grandchildren, grandfathers dote on the little rascals, too. Douse means plunge into water, drench, extinguish. For example, they doused each other with hoses and water balloons. Dowdy means slovenly, untidy. For example, she tried to change her dowdy image by buying a new fashionable wardrobe. Downcast means disheartened, sad. For example, cheerful and optimistic by nature, Beth was never downcast despite the difficulties she faced. Drab means dull, cheerless. For example, the Dutch woman's drab winter coat contrasted with the distinctive, colorful native costume she wore beneath it. Draconian means extremely severe. For example, when the principal canceled the senior prom because some seniors had been late to school that week, we thought the draconian punishment was far too harsh for such a minor violation of the rules. Dregs means sediment, worthless residue. For example, David poured the wine carefully to avoid stirring up the dregs. Drivel means nonsense, foolishness. For example, why do I have to spend my days listening to such idiotic drivel? Droll means queer and amusing. For example, he was a popular guest because his droll anecdotes were always entertaining. Drone means idle person. For example, content to let his wife support him, the would-be writer was in reality nothing but a drone. Drone means talk dully, buzz or murmur like a bee. For example, on a gorgeous day, who wants to be stuck in a classroom listening to the teacher drone? Dross means waste matter, worthless impurities. For example, many methods have been devised to separate the valuable metal from the dross. Drudgery means menial work. For example, Cinderella's fairy godmother rescued her from a life of drudgery. Dubious means questionable, filled with doubt. For example, many critics of SAT I contend the test is of dubious worth. Ductile means flexible. For example, copper is an extremely ductile material. You can stretch it into the thinnest of wires, bend it, even wind it into loops. Dulcet means sweet sounding. For example, the dulcet sounds of the birds at dawn were soon drowned out by the roar of traffic passing our motel. Dumbfound means astonish. For example, Egbert's perfect 1600 on his SATI exam dumbfounded his classmates, who had always found him to be perfectly dumb. Dupe means someone easily fooled. For example, while the gullible Watson often was made a dupe by unscrupulous parties, Sherlock Holmes was far more difficult to fool. Duplicity means double-dealing, hypocrisy. For example, when Tanya learned that Mark had been two-timing her, she was furious at his duplicity. Duration means length of time something lasts. For example, because she wanted the children to make a good impression on the dinner guests, Mother promised them a treat if they'd behave for the duration of the meal. Duress means forcible restraint, especially unlawfully. For example, the hostages were held under duress until the prisoners' demands were met. Dutiful means respectful, obedient. For example, when Mother told Billy to kiss Great Aunt Hattie, the boy obediently gave the old woman a dutiful peck on her cheek. Dwarf means cause to seem small. For example, the giant redwoods and high cliffs dwarfed the elegant Ahwahnee Hotel, making it appear a modest lodge rather than an imposing hostelry. Dwindle means shrink, reduce. For example, the food in the lifeboat gradually dwindled away to nothing. In the end, they ate the ship's cook. Dynamic means energetic, vigorously active. For example, the dynamic aerobics instructor kept her students on the run. She was a little dynamo. End of the word list with words starting with letter D.